always been accused of doing popular things, but the most popular thing I could do here tonight probably is come in under time at this late hour of the evening. Thank you very much, Breed, for your introduction, and I want to express my thanks to Joe Mulholland for inviting me to speak here again this year. In a way, I feel like I'm kind of continuing on from the discussion that I participated in here last year, because that was, too, about the idea of a new republic. And I remember on that occasion talking about the way I see history, that in many ways we've kind of almost seen it as three phases since the foundation of the state. That first phase from independence up to the end of the 50s, a period of consolidating independence. It was conservative, it was poor, it was insular, it was protectionist. And you then had the second phase, which was the opening out, the opening up of the economy, the modernisation of our society, the liberalisation of our laws, the increase in prosperity, which ended, of course, in the recent economic collapse, and that we need to see a third phase growing out of that economic crisis, the creation of a new republic. And I recall, for example, discussing here last year issues a lot of which had to do with institutions and systems of government and reform of the public service. And I remember in particular suggesting perhaps that one of the things that we need to do here, if we're serious about reforming our public service, is to have a dedicated department of the public service which leads that on. But this year we have, I suppose, a more challenging task, and that is to relate the development of a new republic to the ideals and to the ambitions of the founding fathers of the state, founding mothers of the state. And two things happened to me yesterday which caused me to kind of join the two pieces together. One was a visit to the digital hub in the Liberties of Dublin, much of it located in the old Guinness buildings. And the second was a walk that I took through a historic part of our city with descendants of the signatories of the 1916 Rising. I was very privileged yesterday to walk with grandson of James Connolly, two granddaughters of Thomas MacDonagh, a granddaughter of Ned Daly, who in turn was related to Tom Clark, and other relatives of the descendants of the 1916 leaders. From the GPO, the track they took through Henry Place, down Moore Lane, into Moore Street, into 16 Moore Street, where they eventually decided to surrender. And then the walk from there up to where they were eventually rounded up in the rotunda. And it was an embarrassment to walk with people whose grandparents had taken such a courageous stand there through such a derelict part of the centre of our city. Derelict buildings, including the historic buildings on Moore Street themselves, where so much of the action had taken place, awaiting some kind of development. And the development being proposed for it, and for which planning approval has been given, is a kind of a shopping centre like Dundrum, which will obliterate the historic walk and the historic journey that these leaders took at the time, which probably will not now take place because the developer and the development and the properties are going into Nama. And as we walked up Moore Street and up Moore Lane, we passed the pathway that councillors in the early 90s and 80s used to scurry along from Conway's pub into the back of the old Dublin County Council building so that they could vote on rezoning of motions, fuelling the property speculation and the bubble which eventually led to the collapse of our economy. And as we contemplate, and we're heading into a decade when we're going to be commemorated out, our army is going to be exhausted, walking up and down outside the GPO, commemorating 1916 and one event after another. I think there are two things that we could usefully do. One is to actually take on board the suggestion that these descendants of the heroes of 1916 made, which is to create perhaps a cultural quarter in this part of the centre of our city. But more importantly, I think it is to rededicate ourselves to build the new republic to meet the ambitions and to meet the ideals of those heroic founding fathers of the state. And that brings me to the second event, which was the visit to the digital hub, because that's where I met the people who are going to build the new republic. Young people in their 20s, in denims and T-shirts, working on the future. Over 90 different companies, dealing with a range of high-tech, information age, ideas and initiatives and businesses. And, you know, it was interesting to hear their take on the economy. They're looking at the future. They don't belong to the past. They're proud of the past. I met one man who told me that his father, his grandfather, and indeed his father before him, had worked in the very same building, the old printing works in Guinness's. And they worked there printing the labels that used to be stuck on the porter bottles. And he's now working there, and he's making animation films. And the idea that he wanted to put to me was, and he reminded me of the initiative that Michael D. Higgins introduced when we were last in government, the tax relief for the film industry and so on, now called Section 481. And he suggested, he says, couldn't we extend Section 481 to games? Pointed out to me that, for example, that games, computer games, are now bigger as a business than Hollywood, and that there was the potential for 5,000 jobs to be created in this country if such a relief were extended. And I thought, you know, 5,000 jobs, that's more jobs than was ever in Guinness's when it was making stout at the height of its time, and when you had Coopers and so on. And I think that what we have to do, you know, and it is, we often, when we get to talk about, you know, the new republic and how it's going to be framed and so on, we talk because we're politicians and we're people, we're historians and we're economists and we're administrators and so on. We talk about institutions. We talk about governance and, you know, restructuring and so on and so forth. What we have to talk about, I think, is enabling a new generation of people to get on with business, to get on with making a life for themselves and to building the new economy. Because the new republic is not just about political institutions. And the new republic is about enabling people to live their lives and to build a better society. And there is always this tussle, and I think it's in this discussion, between what we need to do in the immediate term. What are we going to do about the 3 billion? What are we going to do about reforming the public sector? What are we going to do about this institutional reform or that institutional reform? And then, you know, where's the vision? You know, what are we trying to achieve? I think part of our problem is that we tend to err on either side. We tend to be either too short-term or too visionary. And what we need to do, I think, is find ourselves a point on the horizon that is long enough to be visionary, and yet at the same time that is within a time scale that is capable of being realistic. And the point on the horizon that I want to suggest to us, that I think we should pick and that we should aim to do a number of things towards, is 2021. It'll be the centenary of, you know, the treaty and the foundation of the state and all that goes with it. It's about 10 years away. We tend to think in decades. It's the lifetime of 2 Doyles or 2 governments. And we need to have a look at what it is we want to do over that period of time. And in doing that, the first thing I think that we have to take on board is that the world will have changed again by 2021. And we need to think, by the way, not just Ireland. We need to think world. Because the 20-year-olds, the 20-somethings that I met in the digital hub, that's what they think, and that's what we need to think if we're going to have a successful country. And we need to think about that kind of 2021 point at the horizon, when there'll be an extra billion people in the world. There'll be an extra 750 million people who will have joined what is broadly called the middle class and will be part of the whole global trading system. When the economic powerhouses of the world will have shifted, China and India and so on, we know what is happening there. When there'll be an increased demand for energy, and yet at the same time the availability of oil and access to it will be greatly reduced. And what we need to do is we need to understand that changed world and frame the decisions that we have to make now in order to fit into that. And what that means, I think, in practical terms, for this country is this, that when we think about economic recovery, yes, there are immediate things that we need to do. And the Labour Party has suggested, for example, a strategic investment bank, and we've suggested a jobs fund, and we have suggested that there are shovel-ready projects that we should proceed with in order to get people back to work in the short term. But we need to think about how our economy is going to be positioned in order to be a prosperous economy a decade from now. And therefore we need to think about the opportunities that the growing population of the world is offering to us, that these new markets are offering to us, and to make the decisions now, for example, to ensure that our IDAs and our Enterprise Irelands are in China and in India, trying to forge the kind of alliances and partnerships with new companies there in order to grow the markets for our own economy, but also to see what the potential is for inward investment from those companies into the future. And in doing that, we need to understand that where the decisions and how decisions about foreign direct investment is going to be made in the future. Why, for example, it is important that we have the research and innovation hubs in our universities that's likely to attract that investment. We need to understand that in this kind of a growing market, the opportunities there are for some particular sectors of our economy, like, for example, food. If there are more people in the world, they're going to need more food. If there are more middle-class people in the world, then they're going to need perhaps different types of food products. We need, too, to look at where we're going to be in terms of energy provision and energy sourcing over that decade. We have a very natural advantage in this country. We own a piece of the globe that is 10 times our land size, and that are the seas that are around us, which have enormous potential for the development of wind and wave energy. We need to look at the other areas which contribute to that, like what we need to do in education and training. Yes, there are things that we need to do now in the short term in education and training. We need to, first of all, address the immediate requirement that there is, that 40%, for example, of those who are now out of work, 450,000 people on the live register, the biggest it's ever been, 40% of the people who are now out of work are out of work for longer than a year. We cannot afford to allow long-term unemployment to become endemic again in this society. And that is why we need to radically change our approach to education and training. We need to get it into our heads that nobody should go directly from school or college directly onto the dole. That at a minimum, they should go back into education and training, into job placement schemes, into work experience programs, rather than going directly onto the dole. And in looking at our education and training systems, again, we need to think that decade ahead and what the potential is. We have a lot of talk about what needs to change in the education system and structures and so on. One of the most interesting things that I've seen in recent times was, and I saw it at an event which was organised by Microsoft, and this was three Leaving Cert pupils from Longwood in County Meath, in a school where there's no chemistry teacher. But they're studying chemistry to a higher level at the Leaving Cert because they're able to log on, go online and study it and plug into the course that is going on in the nearby school in Dunshaughlin. And when you think of the potential that offers in terms of we talk about economies, we talk about efficiencies and so on. We are moving to a stage where not every school needs to have the teacher in every subject. There are new opportunities for revamping and reorganising our education system. The same in the area of health. There's going to be a 50% by the 2021 kind of target I'm talking about. We'll have a 50% increase in the number of people over 65. The number of people over 80 will have doubled. The economists will work out what that's going to cost us in terms of additional cost of our healthcare service. But look at the other side of the equation. Look at what companies like Intel are doing, for example, in developing new products which will enable people to live at home for longer, independently. Look at the initiatives that are being taken, which will allow for a greater emphasis on preventative health. And let's try and design a reorganised health service, which is not just about bean counting, not just about what do we save here, what do we save there, what kind of structures do we have here, but is actually about delivering the best modern service for the public in the most cost-effective way. We've had the same issue today, local government reform. It's back on the agenda. We have talked ourselves. I remember being here at a summer school some years ago talking about local government reform. We have talked ourselves for the last 3 decades around local government reform and town councils and county councils and where the boundaries should be. In the new world, it doesn't matter, because we are moving to a stage where what will matter now is the smart city, the smart county, the interconnectedness between people, and where the boundary is going to be less and less relevant. And therefore, our approach to looking at things like local government reform, I think, needs to anticipate where things are going to be at in another decade. We do, of course, need to have reform in the way in which we are governed, and that was one of the reasons why the Labour Party has suggested that there should be a constitutional convention. We've suggested that it should be made up of 3 components: elected representatives, representatives of civic society, and citizens, selected perhaps in the same way as citizens are selected for juries or some variation of that, which would meet over a period of time, look at the kind of system of government we need, what kind of changes do we need in the Oireachtas, what kind of relationship should there be between the legislature and the executive, what kind of structures do we need to have over the course of the next century. I suppose to some extent it would be a bit like having the McGill Summer School sitting in Dublin Castle and required to reach some conclusions which would then be put to the people in a referendum. But there are immediate things we can do, and I believe that a new government could and should do them. There's absolutely no reason why we can't have the Dáil and the Oireachtas meeting 4 days a week, cutting out the long periods of recesses. There's absolutely no reason why the Dáil can't be a genuine legislature. Every piece of legislation, particularly reforming legislation that doesn't involve major costs on the state, there's absolutely no reason why that must always come exclusively from the executive. You take, for example, an area that has been talked around over the last number of years, the whole problem there are in apartments, in multi-unit developments, where management companies, the requirement to put in place legislation to regulate management companies, to govern the way in which they work. It's a hugely relevant issue for people who have bought apartments or bought houses in mixed developments, and where this is unregulated. Absolutely no reason why the legislature shouldn't be enabled to go ahead and do the reforming legislation which is required in that area. And what is required there is for a new government to have the confidence to allow the Oireachtas to legislate and to make reforming laws. But of course, to do all of that, there has to be change. And the principal change that has to take place in order for any of that to happen is political change. I am sometimes interested to see some of the discussion that there is about the necessity we must change the system. Talking about changing the system is about looking at your favourite football team and seeing them doing badly and saying, God, we must change the rules of the game. What most teams do when the team is doing badly is they change the team or they change the manager. And that is the first change that we need to undertake in doing that. And when we do that, I think that it mustn't be simply a case of changing the guard. Because as Richard has said, the challenges that face a new government are very difficult. And I believe that when a new government is elected, and I hope that it will be elected sooner rather than later, I believe that we must assemble around that government the very best talent that is available in this country. I agree with the suggestion that he has made that there should be a change in the boards of companies, but it shouldn't just be a change of clearing out one set of political appointees and replacing them with another set of political appointees. It must be a change that involves bringing to bear on the work that the state has to do the very best minds and the very best talents. And one of the things I believe that we could and should do is that we could and should establish what I call a National Economic Council, a body which would be drawn from business, from public administration, from economists, on a pro bono basis, established for the sole purpose of providing advice, the advice coming from the very best and most talented people in our country on economics for a new government. But back, I suppose, to the issue of the Founding Fathers. because, as Dermot pointed out at the beginning, of course, they weren't unanimous in what the ideals and the ambitions should be, and he drew attention to the remark that was made by Kevin O'Higgins that they were the most conservative revolutionaries ever to have successfully won a revolution. The tradition in that I represent is the Labour tradition. It is a tradition that took a very active part in the founding of the state. Connolly was actively involved in the writing of the proclamation. Citizen Army and Connolly took part in the 1916 rebellion. Tom Johnson is credited with the writing of the democratic programme. But of course, and again as Dermot has pointed out, Labour was asked to stand aside at the foundation of the state in order that the independence movement could win. Not only was Labour asked to stand aside at that point, but I think it seems to me, in looking at the history of the Labour Party and the Labour movement over the intervening decades, there were many occasions when Labour was also, or it was gently hinted to Labour, that if not only that it was asked to stand aside at the beginning, but that perhaps it should occasionally stand back and know its place in the intervening years. That no longer applies. The Labour Party's objective at this point in time is to seek to lead a new government. I know there are people who, say, God, that's awfully ambitious for the Labour Party, and is it realistic, and so on, and are they losing the run of themselves and moving out of their assigned place? But, every other modern democracy in Europe, we regard that as perfectly normal, that a Labour Party or a Social Democratic Party would come to lead a government, and it has happened repeatedly in most European democracies. And it will happen here too. Thank you very much indeed.